So listen, my name's Will. Dana, thank you for that great presentation. I came to this work because I represented tenant associations for a decade in Washington, D.C., and I represented them when their affordable housing was at risk, when developers wanted to tear down their affordable housing, displace the people who live there, and in their place build housing that wasn't affordable for people. And in doing that work, what I saw were these communities that would be, it was like a flood of money pouring into these communities from investors that would drive up the land cost in these neighborhoods and incentivize developers to try to attract that money by proposing development deals that would maximize the profit for those investors. So I started paying attention to not the developers as much in this process, but the people who were investing in this housing production, because I look at the developers as they're like vacuum cleaners. If money is out there in the world, the developers will try to suck up that money to build what investors want to build. And the investors want to build things that are going to make them the most return on their investment. And these investors, what I found in researching these development deals, were huge private equity funds, sovereign wealth funds. So just a gigantic amount of money was pooled together by these people, and it was looking for places to invest. DC real estate has become a great place for these investors to invest because the market can support this luxury development. And that is why, part of the reason why we've seen such transformation in Washington, D.C., and the displacement that's happened from that transformation. I refer to it sort of like it's really become a real estate boomtown, Washington, D.C. So that made me start to want to look for alternative forms of economic development that could develop equitably and sustainably. And that's when I came across social housing as an alternative economic development model. And I founded an organization to further research that model and to write about that model, to try to build political will for that model to be implemented. So before I dive into social housing and what it is and what it isn't, I wanted to very quickly just use a case study to explain what I'm talking about by this investor capital and this flood of money that's coming into the district. And to do that, I wanted to talk about the Wharf. The Wharf was vacant public land. Where the Wharf sits now, it was public land that was owned by DC. The DC government gave away that public land that was used to create the Wharf for $1. The land was valued at $95 million. They gave that land away for $1 to this developer who built the Wharf. The district then pumped in an additional $300 million in public subsidies to help that developer build what is now the Wharf on the Southwest waterfront. The developer took this public land and took this promise of these additional government subsidies, and they went to those investors that I was just talking about. And they found a Wall Street bank that everybody, is sort of everybody knows about this bank, Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs the developer said to Goldman Sachs, hey, we got this government in DC to give us all this land, and they're going to pump a bunch of more subsidies into it. We want to build this big luxury development, and we're going to make a ton of money on it. Do you want in? And Goldman Sachs said, yeah, of course we want in. So they gave the developer $847 million to invest in the building of the Wharf. The investor then also got from a private equity fund another $220 million investment. So we saw in this little slice in the Southwest waterfront over $1 billion of capital, money injected into that neighborhood. So here's the question. What do you think happens to property values in a neighborhood when there is $1 billion that is injected into a small part of that neighborhood? The answer to that question is that it makes the property values go up substantially. And this causes speculation across that neighborhood. So what kind of behavior does that incentivize? Well, in the Southwest waterfront in the Navy Yard, what it did was it incentivized big time developers to see an opportunity to attract more of this investor money and build their own luxury apartments. They sold investors who had money to spend on the idea that the Wharf was an anchor that would then promote a glut of further luxury development in the Southwest waterfront. And to make way for these new luxury development projects, what did they do? The large developers with access to all this private equity investor money bought up affordable housing, demolished it, and built housing that was not affordable in its place. So that the end of that story is that the Southwest waterfront and the Navy Yard went from one of the most affordable neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. to one of the most unaffordable neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. over a very short period of time. In the midst, and I mean, this is the irrationality of an economic development system built this way, that in the midst of an affordable housing crisis, D.C. government gave all that public money to a private developer to attract all this investment capital in order to build penthouse condos that now, one of the penthouse condos at the Wharf sold for $12.6 million. So that is what we're using our public resources for in the midst of an affordable housing crisis. To me, that's a completely irrational system. So the pivot, the question then becomes, is that type of economic development sustainable? I think not. Who does it benefit? Obviously, investors, private equity, developers that are building this. Who does it harm? Working class people in Washington, D.C. As Dana illustrated, the working class has been a working class Black population that was displaced through those types of development projects. So how do we do something different? How do we, when I was representing tenant associations east of the river, and I would talk to tenant associations, people were very clear to me that they wanted development in their communities. What they didn't want is development that came at the expense of them. They wanted to stay in their communities. They wanted sustainable development in their communities. So that is sort of where decommodified models of housing come in. If financialization, what I just described at the Wharf, that's a type of housing financialization. It's a phenomena that occurs when housing is treated as a vehicle for wealth and investment rather than a social good. Decommodification, housing decommodification, means that a system in which the purpose of building housing is to house people, to look at housing as a social good as opposed to a vehicle for investment and wealth creation. So social housing, all that is, it's a type of decommodified housing model. The thing that makes there's a couple different types of social housing. Limited equity co-ops that have been around in DC for a very long time, you could argue, are a type of social housing. What we're arguing for, and when I say we, I mean myself at the Center for Social Housing and Public Investment, is a social housing model that is buildings that are municipally owned. That's very, very important that they're municipally owned. I'll come back to that, why that's so important in a second. But municipally owned buildings that are mixed income and that are designed to be self-sustainable, meaning that the building pays for itself. The way social housing works is that the government uses public money to build high quality mixed income housing. The mixed income nature of the housing, the fact that there's different people in the building paying different levels of rent, ensure that the rents coming in are enough to pay for the operating cost of the building, and cover the monthly mortgage payment that every building has to pay off when it gets built. So unlike public housing, it doesn't concentrate only low-income renters who don't have enough money to pay in rent in order to cover operating costs. What we've seen in DC with that public housing model is when the rents that people pay aren't sufficient to cover the cost of the building to keep it livable, that the building crumbles around the people that live in it. That's a failure of the federal government with respect to not providing enough operating subsidy. But I don't want to get off on that tangent. But that is what separates a publicly owned social housing model from traditional public housing, the mix of incomes and the ability to cover operating costs and pay for the mortgage. Now, this is the really exciting part of social housing. After the mortgage is paid off, so usually the mortgage is 20 or 30 years. After that mortgage is paid off, the government now owns the housing, and they can reinvest the rent equity that they were using to pay off the mortgage to build more social housing. So the thing that social housing models that are self-sustainable do is they work as an ecosystem. Instead of a developer pocketing it's called, equity, and all equity means from a building is that the rent that is paid into a building. Instead of a developer pocketing that rent equity, that equity is invested back into the network, into the ecosystem to build more housing. This is the way that models have been done internationally and now increasingly in the United States, is that these buildings are government owned, but they're privately managed. And because it's self-sustaining, because the buildings can pay for themselves, the model can scale. So you can build a lot of social housing in a short period of time. And that is a little bit more complicated discussion on how to finance a model that scales past just self-sustainability, that I'd be happy to have at a later time if you guys want to have me back, but I'm not going to be able to get to it today. There are models in the United States that are building, there are municipalities in the United States that are building social housing right now. And one of them is right across the road in Montgomery County, Maryland. They just built a social housing model called the Laureate that is right above the Shady Grove Metro. It's mixed income housing. The New York Times did a feature on it. And so it's a model that's catching on in the United States. I know that East is going to talk more about the movement for social housing in the United States. So maybe she can talk more about other communities doing it. But the Montgomery County model uses the model that I just described, municipally owned, self-sustaining. They are scaling a vast network of social housing. The international model that everybody points to with social housing is the model in Vienna, Austria. In Vienna, Austria, half of their housing stock is social housing. So that accounts for 222,000 units in Vienna. They have a social housing. Rents in Vienna. Vienna has been rated by a lot of magazines, a lot of trade publications as the most desirable place to live in the world. A big reason why it's rated that way is because it's a world-class city, it has a United Nations headquarters, it has great food, it has, all the luxuries of a really nice place to live, but housing is extremely affordable because they have created this social housing model. People pay on average 21% of their income in rent, and that is across both the public and the private sector. 21% of their income in rent on average. So what Vienna has done, and what the purpose of a social housing model is to drive down rents across both the public and the private sector through decommodifying housing, meaning building a bunch of housing that does not operate for profit, but operates on the concept of housing people who need housed, but doing so sustainably through this mixed income model. I have a lot of articles that I've written about the Montgomery County model that I've written that are on my website. I can drop the link to my website in the chat if people want to explore it further.
Can we count on our government to either be benevolent and to also hold its commitment to continuing to house folks in that way? So I'm going to pass both of those to to Will, and then folks can come off mute, raise your hand with your next question.
Let me take the second one first about being benevolent, because I think that's a very important point. One of the reasons why social housing, these municipally owned social housing models are catching on in the United States is because it's actually a much more efficient way to build housing for municipalities than the current private market produces housing. And the reason why that is because when a private developer wants to build something, he goes to a bank and he gets a traditional loan for his construction money. But banks only fund about 50 to 60% of construction loans for private development because private development is extremely risky. So that same developer has to go out and hustle for this private equity money that I talked about earlier. That private equity money forms the last 40 to 50% of his construction package to build his housing. That money, the developer has to pay the private equity like 15 to 20% interest on that money. So that makes the building of the building extraordinarily expensive. And it gives these investors a say in what gets built, which is why luxury things are being built at the rate they're being built. So it's inefficient because it costs a lot and it doesn't house people who need house, which makes government have to spend money on the back end on subsidies, on shelter cost. It's very expensive when people fall into homelessness. So what municipalities are realizing is that social housing is much more efficient because in a social housing model, the government goes to a bank and gets 50 to 60% of their construction capital, and then they just use public money for the rest at zero interest. So the thing that gets built is a lot cheaper. It's a lot cheaper to build. And then when people, the people that are housed by it are people that actually need to be housed, that don't fall into homelessness, that don't cost the government money on the back end. So it's more efficient to build, and it's not benevolent. It's just a better way to provide housing for a broad sector of a municipality's population, because again, the private market has become so commodified by this financialization, this obsession with wealth creation for these investors, that it's completely removed from the realities of housing people. If a sovereign wealth fund from Saudi Arabia is investing in the Wharf in DC, they do not care about DC's local housing crisis. It doesn't matter to them. And they're the ones that are providing money for what's built. So that is what gets built is what they want. So what we're doing is localizing the production process and re-centralizing it back to meet the needs of those that need housed and doing it more efficiently. The Montgomery County model, when I talk about the government using this public money to fund this construction, they issued a $50 million municipal bond. And that is what Montgomery County is using as their construction money to build social housing that pays for itself. That $50 million bond, you know how much it costs the county each year? $3.1 million. They pay off the $50 million bond by paying $3.1 million each year for 20 years. That adds up to $62 or $68 million. That's the principal and interest on that bond. So for $3.1 million a year, they have a $50 million production fund. That is efficiency. So it's not benevolence. It is, if a government is serious about solving this crisis, then that is how you build efficiently and you build to rationally meet people's needs, which is why it's so important to talk about broad decommodification when we talk about how to build rental housing and how to move towards a rational housing market.